So the vast majority of people are playing out some sort of unconscious emotional manipulation just from a place of not knowing any better. Manipulation works best when you are disconnected from your own perception and you are disconnected from your own connection with reality. For a lot of women, especially after relational hurt, the wound isn't just about the heartbreak, it's the collapse of the trust in our own judgment. The predator is going to go for fearful and easier prey. So a dysregulated person is a more fearful person, and a more fearful person is far more easier to manipulate than a regulated one. So if your body is in survival, your standards are going to get much harder to hold. Welcome back. I want to speak today on a topic that is super important and super empowering for all women and the women that I work with, and that is how to understand and avoid being manipulated. Because as we become more secure in ourselves, we build the desire to have stronger and healthier relationships, then this idea of manipulation really comes to the forefront, comes to the surface, not only in how other people treat us, but also in our own patterns and looking at where we may be a little bit manipulative because we're not confident in directly asking for what it is that we need or we want. And there are a ton of patterns that kind of get in the way of us actually really feeling secure in meeting our needs, requesting what it is that we want, and therefore not having to feel like we need to manipulate to get our needs met. And so then we understand it from within ourselves. It's much easier to understand it within another person. And that doesn't mean that we hold toxic compassion, this kind of endless compassion for other people doing destructive things, but we're less likely to feel victimized by it. And we're much more likely to hold a clear boundary in a situation where that can mean we don't no longer interact with that person and we keep them at a distance because of their repeated behavior. Or if it's a healthier relationship and it's something that we need to grow and evolve through, our understanding of the pattern is what is going to allow it to change within us or within another person and actually elevate and evolve the relationship to a much higher standard. So something that we all need to understand. I'm going to unpack it for you today. So when we think about these terms like manipulation, often it can kind of make your body tense or recoil or respond in a kind of fearful way to some degree. And this is because we don't have enough knowledge around it. And knowledge is power. The more knowledge we have, the less fear we have. And the less fear we have, the more confidently we can work with something. So it's not about becoming closed, and it's not about becoming armored. It's about being really discerning with these patterns and understanding them and seeing where they come up, and then also what are the skill sets, which we're going to go through today, that you need to develop in order to make sure that manipulation slides right off you. So it's about becoming rooted in deep self-trust and discernment, and embodied boundaries is really, really important so that these dynamics completely lose their grip on you, and that's what we want. So the women that I work with are so intelligent, they're so self-aware, they're so empathic, they're so compassionate, and oftentimes we can be a little bit too porous or a little bit too empathic that we end up inside of these manipulative dynamics. And I've definitely been in ones that felt very destabilizing and very confusing because I wasn't trusting my own inner knowing. I wasn't trusting my own inner compass. I wasn't trusting my own boundaries. And I had to really do a lot of work to heal from that, to come back to myself. And so it's something very close to my heart and something very important that I work on with the women around me, because it took me a lot of work and self-trust to cultivate an embodiment that really where I really trust myself in the face of people that are being manipulative, and that those hooks can't really reach me. So it's not, if you get manipulated, it's not because you're foolish. You're going to, we're ultimately going to feel a little bit stupid for being led on or being manipulated in some way. But I'm here to just remind you that, you're not stupid, you're not foolish. It's a tactic. Manipulation is a tactic to get a need met. And if you care about people, you want to make them feel good and you want to help them meet their needs. And so they're trying to get a need met, and they're essentially going to try to do that by any means possible. And so it can be a really hard dynamic to break. And this is why it's not just, it wouldn't be of service for me to come in here and just tell you what manipulation looks like, because spotting the signs just makes you more guarded, more tense. And yes, pattern recognition is really important. It's really important to understand that. But what we want to cultivate is the embodiment to make sure the hooks can't get into us. And that is what we're really going to focus on today. So if you have a history of relational pain or manipulation of some sort, of not trusting yourself, feeling confused, feeling like you're not sure if you should stay or leave, or just not really being able to trust your own body, that's because most people out there haven't been taught or don't have the skills to know how to meet their needs relationally in a clean and secure way. They don't know how to ask for what they need. They don't know how to identify their need, ask for what it is, and then assess whether it can be met or not. So the vast, vast, vast majority of people are playing out some sort of unconscious emotional manipulation just from a place of not knowing any better. So we're going to go through 7 qualities, 7 things that you need to embody so that these hooks can't get into you as much, if at all. And also, these are going to reflect the qualities that somebody who is manipulative doesn't have. Because sometimes we give power away to toxic patterns. Like when we see someone being very misogynistic or very controlling, and we think it's a powerful position, when it's actually a position built in a lot of fear and insecurity. Manipulation is just the same thing. So people think, oh, I was manipulated, and then they victimize themselves and they put that person in a position of power when the whole pattern existed because that person was small and fearful and insecure and didn't know how to have their needs met, didn't know how to communicate, didn't know how to request those things. So they were just a very insecure person. And it's not about you having power over them or them having power over you. It's about understanding of the mechanism so that you are free of the hurt of what happened in that dynamic, so that you can grieve it and learn from it and grow from it without thinking that person has some sort of power over you, because they absolutely don't. So the first quality you want to be embodying is self-trust. Sounds broad and basic, but manipulation works best when you are disconnected from your own perception and you are disconnected from your own connection with reality. And so you are handing authority over to the other person. Because essentially what is happening is you're getting your perception of reality manipulated. And I'm not saying we don't want to be questioning our perception of reality. We constantly want to be upgrading, questioning, and dissolving and kind of recreating our perception of reality. But that doesn't mean we're adopting somebody else's perception of reality. We're just upgrading our own to a new set of beliefs, a new way of seeing things that actually feels good and expands us. It's not about adopting somebody else's perception of reality. And this is also, I want to add here, why it's really important to keep our close friendships or our close relationships with people as people that have a kind of similar kind of belief set and perception of reality. Because otherwise, you're going to have to abandon yourself in some way or just not have the nourishing experience in relationship, because that person's perception of reality is going to be either, it's going to be far more negative than yours, or maybe it's more evolved than yours, whatever that is. And so if each person can't just like cleanly hold their perception of reality and that doesn't work together, somebody, the more fearful and more insecure person in that dynamic, is going to want to bend the other person's perception of reality to fit theirs, whether it suits them or not. So this brings us back to this idea of self-trust, of trusting our perception of reality, even though it's always changing, we're always evolving. But I have self-trust in who I am, how I see things, my values, the way that I operate. And so I'm not handing authority over to somebody else around my perception of reality. But there's a very, very important caveat to this. To trust your perception of reality has to be serving you and nourishing you. So when you've got a lot of negative beliefs and a lot of wounding and a lot of unresolved trauma, your perception of reality isn't going to be serving you. So you are looking for upgraded beliefs. You are looking for an upgraded perception of things. And when you get to that place where you've upgraded that enough that you perceive things in a way that are actually conducive with a good life, a healthy life, secure relationships, and there's a health and vitality and thriving involved in the way that you perceive reality, that's when you trust it. When it's distorted and really wounded, you don't trust it. And that's for very good reason. So the more wounding, the less self-trust, the more we are likely to hand that perception of reality over to another person, the authority over the way that we see things. And when we do that, we are more easily manipulated, because somebody can bend our reality to suit their reality or the way that they want people to see them. So manipulation thrives when you doubt your own read on things. So you can see the inconsistency, but then you talk yourself out of it. You can see the patterns, but you convince yourself it's something that it's not. You can feel your body responding to this person in a certain way, but you gaslight yourself or convince yourself that that's not how it is. So it's when there's that mismatch between your inner knowing and what you're telling yourself is happening. So you're creating that congruency between what it is that you're feeling, what your body is communicating with you, and what you're seeing playing out in reality. So that loss of self-trust is often, it's at the core of what keeps the cycle going. So one of the biggest shifts that you can have in healing is learning to believe what you notice, and not from a reactionary point of view, but from a neutral, that's information. Because a lot of the time, people are picking up on all of these cues and it's absolutely accurate, but it's more about, well, if that's accurate, what can I then do with that information? Because if you're just picking up on cues and you're hypervigilant and hypersensitive, then usually you're in a state of just thinking everything's kind of a threat, or you need to control things, or there's a fear-based state. And so you're picking up on all of these cues because you don't know actually what they mean or how you should respond to each one. So you haven't neutralized them through to a place of it just being information. These things are still feel quite threatening. So yes, if you're listening to this, you're probably somebody that picks up on a lot of things. You feel a lot of different things, but the shift is whether you're responding to those from a need to do something about it or control it, or it's too much or it's overwhelming and you're really, really porous in that way, or it's information to help you kind of discern and maneuver and decide, how to interact from a secure way. Very, very different embodiments. So for a lot of women, especially after relational hurt, the wound isn't just about the heartbreak, it's the collapse of the trust in our own judgment. And I think that's really, really important. And you can grieve a person, but then you also have to alchemize and move through the shame and the self-judgment around that collapse of self-trust, or how much you allowed that to kind of be questioned or eroded. So self-trust is the foundation. The next skill is what allows you to actually access that self-trust in real time, and that's nervous system regulation. Surprise, surprise. So that's the second skill. A dysregulated person, being an under-resourced person, being somebody that is, when we are quite hypervigilant or ungrounded or emotionally dysregulated, much easier to manipulate. The more fear, the more access there is for manipulation, because manipulation itself, like we've said at the start, is a fear-based state. So fear matches up with fear. Same with predatory behavior of any kind. Somebody that is discerning and boundaried and not fearful is not as attractive to a predator. A predator is going to go for fearful and easier prey. So a dysregulated person is a more fearful person, and a more fearful person is far more easier to manipulate than a regulated one. So when you're activated, you are more likely to chase relief as well instead of truth. And manipulation is like a breadcrumbing thing, because the needs of that person aren't consistently satiated. They don't know how to satiate that. And so they're trying to get those needs met in a really inconsistent way. And so if you're wired to chase relief instead of consistency because of the dysregulation of your nervous system, then that's a great match for manipulative tactics. And you're also much more inclined to associate or interpret intensity and emotional ups and downs and breadcrumbing as a relationship or as love or as connection. You're also much more likely to really cling on to the good moments and minimize the ones that feel off or destabilizing. So, and also what I'll say in there is that you're also much more likely to abandon your standards. And that's because the anxiety or the destabilization or the dysregulation can feel overwhelming enough that you just want to chase that bit of relief. And so to do that, you're much more likely to compromise your boundaries and standards just to get out of some of that intensity. So if your body is in survival, your standards are going to get much harder to hold. So this is why so many women don't need more advice on like how to look necessarily for manipulation tactics, or to be able to like identify them in terms of analyzing people. You actually need more access to yourself. Develop the skills that mean you don't have to be on high alert, because you are confident in knowing that if it doesn't meet your needs, if it's not secure, if it doesn't meet your standards, if it makes you abandon yourself or cross your boundaries, it's not getting access to you. That is a whole lot easier than the mental overload of constantly understanding and psychoanalyzing, like all of these tactics and tools and ways that people do things, and all of these labels that we have in modern psychology that just keeps people overwhelmed and learning the new thing and confused and not actually changing any of it at its core and staying guarded and staying mistrusting. So this is what really, really shifts you out of that pattern and actually gets you to the place of confidence around what you will and won't tolerate. Because when your system is dysregulated in that way and you are kind of looking because you're afraid and you don't trust yourself, you're not relating from clarity. You're not relating from self-trust. You're relating from fear. You're relating from urgency. And you're relating from meaning-making or trying to make sense of something rather than developing that self-trust. So once a woman can regulate enough to actually see these dynamics playing out, or she can regulate herself enough to be present with reality, to breathe and actually be there in reality because she's not just so urgent and scattered, then this is where the next skill comes in, and that is discernment. Because you can't discern when you are dysregulated, you're just operating from survival. So discernment is that third skill. And a lot of women have empathy. A lot of women have compassion, but not a lot of women have true discernment. So a lot of us are deeply empathic and can really feel other people's energy, feel another person's pain, their wounds, their history, also their potential. That's not uncommon. It's quite common for us to really be able to feel each other. What's uncommon is addressing how porous that is, how enmeshed or confusing that feeling each other is, and actually creating those sovereign boundaries and discernment around your own energy body so you're not accessible to people that have unclear or wounded kind of patterns or unclean intentions. And so this is the difference. So a lot of women are really I see a lot of women get really stuck in that uber feeling kind of realm where their own scaffolding, their own boundaries, and their own standards haven't really been developed. And I've been there, and that's that next level up that allows you to go from these unclean dynamics to ones that a position where you're far more discerning because you have more of that sovereign holding of yourself. Because empathy without boundaries or discernment very easily becomes self-betrayal. It very easily allows you to give your energy away to try and have a need met in an environment that's just not meeting you. So understanding why someone behaves the way they do does not change how the behavior impacts your energy body. So this is why you can understand why somebody does things from a very empathetic viewpoint, but that completely disregards the impact that is having on you. Women do this a lot. They go straight for the compassionate understanding and discount the impact the behavior is having on them. And not just women, men do this too, but I'm here speaking to women, but everybody does this. It's like, if I can just be over understanding, I can bypass my own system, my own boundaries, my own standards, my bodily responses, and the impact that person's behavior is having on my energy body. This is why so many people will kind of come out of these situations where they've just been over understanding, over compassionate, and they're just like, I'm exhausted. I've given so much. I'm truly exhausted. And that's because you're confusing compassion with actual access to your energy. You can have compassion for someone while still being very discerning around how much access to your energy they will get, how much you will invest in that person. So you have compassion for the person, observe the behavior, and then based on the behavior, you discern how much energy, time, love, money, whatever that is, you're going to invest in that person. A lot of the time people are missing that. We don't see. This is why the nervous system regulation is crucial, because if you can't regulate, your senses aren't online as much as they should be. So you don't see, you're not watching the patterns. You're relating with somebody that's there, but they're there maybe this much and the patterns are this much. And this is why somebody that's wounded can be harmful. And so you can love both the wounded, or you can do both. You can love the wound and set boundaries with behavior. And that's what discernment allows you to do. So empathy really just says, okay, I understand and have compassion for what happened to them. But discernment asks what that is doing to you and how you want to interact back based on the behaviors. So it's not unkind to notice that someone has pain and still recognize that they don't have the capacity to meet you. This is the world of discernment and boundaries. So once discernment comes online, you can begin seeing the next step much more clearly, and that's pattern recognition. You can start to really develop pattern recognition. So once you have kind of a bit less porous energy body, a bit more structure, a bit more sovereignty, it's a bit more boundaried. Once you've got that, you can exhale even more. And then you can start to really notice patterns in a greater depth. So what people are trying to do is they're trying to notice the patterns and put labels on everything and understand the terminology around all of it. But they don't have self-trust, they don't have nervous system regulation, and they haven't started to build discernment and boundaries. And so it just plays on that fear and hypervigilance and the armoring and the mistrust of relationships. So when we get to pattern recognition, manipulation loses its power because it stops feeling personal and it starts feeling predictable. And not only does it stop feeling personal because you notice it being attached to another person, it stops feeling personal because they're just trying to meet their baseline needs. And they're going to do it to everybody around them. It's just predictable. So it's not personal to you. It's predictable to the way they behave and the way they're going to behave with other people. Let me put it to you this way. Every single person has had the experience of playing out certain patterns with people, but the person was different. You thought, it's going to be different this time, whether it was a romantic relationship, a business relationship, a friendship. You thought, excuse me, it's going to be different this time, but then the pattern played itself out. Everybody's had that situation. And that's because you weren't seeing the person for who they were. You were seeing them for who you wanted them to be. And so you can have a similar experience with different people. And this is when somebody doesn't know how to have their needs met, excuse me, and they are being manipulative, overly manipulative to get those needs met, it's really got nothing to do with you. If somebody is doing that in quite an intense way, they don't see you at all. I was watching Married at First Sight, which really inspired me to record this episode because, I mean, there's so much manipulation because there's so much insecurity and insecure relational dynamics on that show. So there's a lot of manipulations either through bravado and putting on a certain persona and character, or emotional manipulation, and all to meet these needs that the individual hasn't yet identified, nor have they, recognized or communicated or brought into the space or learned how to meet for themselves. And so I just watch people get so heartbroken, and I've been in that position in the past, and I get that, which is what, really steered me onto this big pathway of healing and embodiment. And I see people take it so, so personally, the way that they're treated. And if you really understood how patterns move through the body, how emotions move through the body, how manipulation tactics are just this subconscious way of getting needs met, you would take so little personally, because it's just a person interpreting stimuli, taking it in through their own filter, and then literally their nervous system working out, okay, how can I best get my needs met in this situation? And sometimes, quite often, the people that become the most manipulative and the most kind of extreme in those situations are doing so because their needs, like their tactics, haven't worked. And you're beginning to set boundaries, and you're starting to say, I'm not okay with these things. And so if they don't have another pathway to get their needs met, they're just going to double down on those same patterns and intensify those patterns until it becomes so painful that they realize that it's not going to work. But that may or may not happen. So again, you can have compassion whilst keeping that distance. So pattern recognition is really important, because often when we're scarce, we're going to group on to hope. We're going to group on to potential. We're going to group on to possibility. But one loving interaction, one loving conversation, or this one or few things the person did does not define a relationship. An apology one time doesn't define somebody's character. Like a single vulnerable moment doesn't make somebody emotionally available. And so the question has to be continuously, it's not, can they be good sometimes? The question has to be, what is the repeated pattern over time? And so the patterns you want to be looking out for are hot and cold behavior, confusing behavior, consistent blame shifting, talking about a future, but the kind of present moment reality isn't matching up. So kind of future faking, being selectively vulnerable when it suits to get a need met, being really charming after distance, putting space between you, and then being, over the top or extra after that. Space is natural and healthy, but when there's emotional highs and lows in it, that's a red flag. This is a big one, really important one that I wrote down. Therapeutic language without behavioral change. I have come across some of the most wounded and manipulative people that use the most therapeutic language. This is why we want to develop pattern recognition, because therapeutic language without behavioral change, it's often used as a defense mechanism and a deflection. It's often used to shift blame. So this is why, rather than listening to the words that tend to sound authoritative, you look for the pattern. And the pattern is usually blame shifting, a lack of accountability, and it's dressed up in language that is potentially going to feel like it disarms you. So we've got to go beneath the words and look for the pattern. And then also making you feel overly responsible for their instability. Another one, which is really important, which is just creating confusion in general. So they're creating confusion and then they're making you really work to restore the connection, which can be incredibly, incredibly painful. And I saw this on maths and I've experienced this. Create the instability and then, make the person like work for it or chase it or come after it, because the individual who's being manipulative feels so insecure and so unworthy. So what feels personal is often just a pattern. It's got nothing to do with you. And if it wasn't you, it would be somebody else in the firing line. So the moment you stop reading isolated moments that are good and start reading patterns and getting it more of a meta, a broader view on everything, then your life changes. But again, you can't do that if you're dysregulated, because when you're dysregulated, you're just on a loop trying to fix what's in front of you and what you can see. You can't get a broader picture. Regulation is spaciousness. It's a resource. You're getting much more capacity to get a broader view, which means you can see patterns overall. You can actually see, not only have you regulated, so you've been able to see your patterns from start to finish, but you are then able to see other people's patterns from a broader view rather than just getting triggered by them, getting caught up in them, and, trying to kind of fix this on this micro level when it actually requires far more spaciousness. So a lot of manipulation survives because women keep giving the exception more power than the overall pattern. So you give that one good bit all the power and all of the fantasy and all of the love, and you overlook the rest of the stuff. So don't assess the connection by its peaks. Assess it by what it repeats over time, long term. So seeing the patterns really, really matters in this whole process. But then also what matters brings us to the next step just as much, because what do you do once you see the pattern? And that's your boundaries. So your capacity for boundaries. So this kind of builds on discernment a bit. Discernment is that awareness, and boundaries is that real action part of it, that capacity to say no. And it's not boundary awareness, it's not boundary suggestion, it's capacity for boundaries. And you have to have capacity for boundaries in that you can bring a boundary forward that you feel uncertain around and not know how to deal with people maybe challenging it or looking to maybe negotiate, which is, if you're setting boundaries or there's conflict and stuff like that, like you'd expect a little bit of negotiation if you're coming in, quite closed off, stuff like this. So boundary capacity isn't just, I have an idea for a boundary, or I have this boundary. It's also, is it multi-layered in that, can I set it and then can I back it up when it's challenged? And also, do I understand it enough that is it open for negotiation in certain ways? And And what would those negotiations be and how would that look? Most people are just like starting to get to know their boundaries, and they're flimsy. When they're challenged, you just collapse. You just go, okay. And you just collapse back into that feeling of like, I can't raise my standards, my needs aren't met, I'm not supported, all of those belief systems. So many women know and understand the concept of boundaries, but the issue is holding them when there is stress, pressure, conflict, a differing opinion. So it's one thing to know your standards in a calm moment, and it's another thing to hold them when someone in front of you is disappointed, they're angry, they're withdrawing, they're pleading with you, or they're trying to pull you back in. So this is where a lot of people lose the boundary. They lose the standard. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about manipulation tactics. If my need is met by me setting this boundary, then no amount of manipulation is going to make me collapse that boundary. And not enough children are raised inside of this, because a lot of children can escalate the emotions and get the parent to collapse their boundary. But that, children are escalating, this is all of emotional manipulation. It comes from childhood, in that my basic needs for emotional regulation, or whatever my needs were, they weren't met. And so I've learned to escalate, that I need to escalate to get those needs met. Escalate through my internal systems, escalate through my emotions to get somebody to pay attention. The idea is that we then don't needs are met, and so we don't have to escalate. But if somebody isn't confident in meeting their own needs and they haven't done that work, then they're going to escalate. You can hold a boundary and they will tantrum or do strange things. Again, you can hold the compassion for that whilst holding the boundary around behavior. Really, really important to know. So a boundary isn't a boundary when it's spoken. Sorry, not sorry. A boundary is a boundary when it's actually held in the face of somebody else testing it or questioning it. Otherwise, it's not a boundary. You don't even know if it's a boundary yourself. You're doubting it. So why should anybody else trust it? Here, okay, so for this section in boundaries, the real work is not just knowing your standards, writing them down, conceptualizing your boundaries. It's staying with yourself in the peak of intensity, even if those standards and boundaries cost you connection to somebody. So if your standards and boundaries cost you a relationship, this is the line you walk. Am I willing to self-abandon to keep the connection in place? Or is this something that I need to hold that is absolutely non-negotiable for me? That is the work. So boundary work is the ability to and capacity to stay with yourself intact in the face of the guilt, the pushback, the charm, or the loss of the connection. So boundary examples can just be engaging less, saying less. You are holding your energy. You don't need to engage if it's an unhealthy, manipulative, or toxic situation. Say less, do less. Also, not arguing your boundaries into existence. You don't justify them, you embody them. So that can be the non-engagement. Not giving people 10 more chances. Not giving people 10 more chances. Notice it, if not the first, second, third time. First time can be an anomaly. Second time, third time's 100% a pattern. Once you've seen it 3 times, then you decide. If you let it go more than that, you're going to erode your own self-trust. Let people's behavior answer your questions and refuse to negotiate on repeat with what has already been shown. Somebody that wants to manipulate you is going to want you to negotiate around your standards in relation to their behavior. Don't do it. Number 6, because manipulation lives in the gray area, it lives in the fog. So when I talk about boundaries, it sounds clear, it sounds confident, but manipulation happens when we're not in that state. When we're in that state, that's very easy to hold. Manipulation happens when there's an unclear energy, and that clarity requires you to have a connection to what is actually true, which is point 6. The 6th skill, which is reality testing. So the 6th skill is this idea of reality testing. So manipulation only works by pulling you out and away from facts and into narrative, into fantasy, into story. So you start relating to potential rather than the actual pattern. So someone can pull you out of the facts that you can see are happening, then they can manipulate you. So you start relating to the explanations and not their behavior. You start focusing on what they meant or what their intentions were instead of what actually happened. And you start really, really clinging to the good moments as proof while ignoring the bad ones and the repeated destabilization. So reality testing is the kind of skill that involves coming back to observable truth. And again, you can't do this when you're in survival because your senses are fogged and skewed and quite numb. And so, this is why these skills all build upon each other. So if you're kind of relating this maybe to a current situation, here are some questions that you might want to just ask yourself to get an idea of what's happening in reality versus the story that you might be caught up in. And that is, what has this person consistently shown me? Map it out over time, just the facts. Emotionless facts. What happens when I express a need? So what happens when I express a need in this situation? Do I feel more grounded over time or more confused? Are their words making reality clearer or harder to pin down? This is crucial. If they're making it clearer, you're going to feel more grounded. If they're making it harder to pin down, you're going to feel more confused. And am I connected to who they are or who I hope that they become? This one's on us. Yeah. So don't judge the connection by the intensity of the good moments, which we've spoken about before. Just judge it by the pattern over time. Get as many facts in reality as possible. And if you feel like you're quite dissociated or you find it hard to connect with reality, sometimes you're really in survival or dysregulated in your nervous system, get really good at practicing observing and being in reality with your senses, and do that in non-threatening environments. In nature is great because your senses will feel safe to open and engage with your surroundings. And when you can do that, then you can just start to notice observable facts and start trusting what you see, what you feel, what you touch, what you smell, what you hear. It's your own unique experience. It's going to be completely different to somebody else's, but that doesn't mean you don't want to trust your own perception of reality. So I see a tree, the leaves are green, I see the grass, my palm feels warm. When I breathe, I feel the air travel in through my nose. I feel some tension in my shoulders. I can hear the sound of the birds, all things that are just observable things related to how you're interacting with reality. Super, super important. So this is why we get stuck in manipulative situations, because you are evaluating the relationship and the situation through meaning and not through evidence that is connected to your embodiment and your senses and the way that you see things. And people often ask me here, but hold on, like, are we ever really truly perceiving reality? That question should come after you have something tangible to ground to, which is what you do with your senses, with your body. First, you build the self-trust, and then there's always an openness to, oh, but what if somebody, that's not green to them? Or I feel this, and then somebody says, oh, but this is the way that I see this. And you're like, oh, actually, that just triggered something in me. You have to anchor to your sensory embodied experience first. And then you've got space to say, okay, what might be negotiable in that, or what might be interesting about questioning some of these things. But if I say I hear birds and somebody tries to tell me that I don't, I'm going to tell them to fuck off, because sure, okay, maybe there are no birds and I've got something where I'm making it up. Again, we have a question like in terms of like what is actually real and everything, but you still have to have a grounded experience in this realm connected to your body, your felt sense, and your five senses. Otherwise, there is no reality. So it's got to be both. Otherwise, you can't create in reality. You can't create relationships. So yes, there's always a question around what is real and what is not, but there has to be something that you're anchored to, and that comes through those embodiment tools. So then we get to the seventh skill. That is probably one of the most challenging, because sometimes the truth is already visible, but we don't want to accept it. And this is a tolerance for disappointment. I would say to make disappointment a feeling that you want to get really, really good at. Like, make it a focus. Because if you can't be disappointed, you can't let go of hope. You can't let go of fantasy. You can't let go of breadcrumbs. You can't let go of things that aren't meeting your needs. There is a very clear pattern in being clean in our relationship dynamics and the way that we operate in the world. And that is, I am connected to my body, identify a need. I either meet that for myself with the skills and the support and everything that I already have, or this is a new need and now I need to negotiate and go out and source if I can get that need met. And I'm going to get rejected and that person's going to say no. What happens with the manipulation is that person says no, but you don't trust yourself that, oh, that person's not meeting it. But am I actually going to meet this need? Will it ever be met? And so you cling on to the person that doesn't quite meet it or doesn't meet it at all because you don't trust that it can be met. Whereas if you were like, this is what I'm looking for and this is what I want, that person said no, that's disappointing. I really wanted it from over here. That's really disappointing. I can be disappointed, I can grieve, I can let go. That's okay. But I'm still going to meet that need. So if that person can't provide you with emotional availability, consistency, If you're not willing to be disappointed in that and feel that disappointment and move on, you're going to get stuck in that loop, and you're going to get stuck. You'll be manipulating too, because you're going to keep trying to get your need met when they've told you either verbally or through their patterns that they can't meet that for you. So one of the deepest reasons manipulation keeps working is that there's a part of us that still wants the fantasy more than the truth. And this comes through not being able to embody and experience disappointment. So we want the potential, we want the version that was there at the beginning when there was a performance or some sort of love bombing or whatever. We want the beautiful moments to mean more than they actually do over the long term of the relationship. And we want an apology to become bigger. We want actual change, and the words aren't enough. And we want something to become what we actually hoped that it could be. And so sometimes what keeps us bound isn't the behavior, it's our resistance to actually accepting what is real and what is right in front of us. And that requires the emotional fluidity, the emotional maturity, the emotional literacy. So you become so much harder to manipulate when you can hear, and you can hear what's being said in reality, and then you can bear the pain of seeing clearly. Because you can hear it and still not want to feel the hurt, feel the disappointment, feel the pain. So you're not going to heal manipulation by becoming better at hoping or wishing or praying. You're going to heal it by becoming better at truth. So sometimes the work is not just figuring out if there's just one more chance to give. It's grieving the fact that you wanted it and it's not there. It's just not there. And that is coming into reality. And then is there another way to build that, or is it just not there? And so when all of these 7 skills really start to come online, everything changes dramatically. You stop needing to be, like we said, hypervigilant all the time, trying to have the labels and understand things mentally, keeping you stuck in your head. Because that clarity, that discernment, that self-trust, that regulation, those boundaries, that relationship with reality, that ability to grieve and feel disappointed gets so much stronger than the hope, than the fear, and that clinging to fantasy. So let's close it there. And if you guys want to get started with this work, click the links below and we go so much deeper inside of my programs. I'll see you next week.